Okay, so I say I came across this museum by accident. I was in another, I think it was in another museum one day, and I picked up a little brochure, and I didn't even realize there was a radio museum just down the road from where I lived. It's literally 5 minutes in the car from where I bought a house in Coquitlam. So I took the family along one day, and I was shown around the museum, and I thought, this is kind of interesting. To have this on my doorstep was a real bonus. So anyway, I started attending the museum every Sunday as a volunteer, and the rest's history, I guess. Anyway, so the Society for the Preservation of Antique Radio in Canada, shortened to SPARC with a C, it's a self-supporting organization, self-funded, and it's located in the Riverview Hospital grounds in Coquitlam. It's a huge area. I can't remember how many acres it is, but it's actually an arboretum. There's some beautiful trees in the grounds there. And the SPARC Museum occupies a sort of a prefab type building at the back of the museum grounds. It's a 1940s building, which used to be the hospital pharmaceuticals warehouse back in the day. It's quite a large building. And the SPARC Museum occupies part of it. The other part has been occupied by various organizations, including, I think at the moment, it's the ambulance service. They've got a depot there. But SPARC occupies something in the order of, I think it's 6,000 square feet. And the bottom part of the building, the top part of the building is not accessible because of asbestos issues. So that's sealed off, but it's not a problem in the museum part. The exhibition area, which you see the door into on this slide, is about 3,000 square feet, and there's another 3,000 square feet or so of workshop and storage space in the building. And before COVID hit, the museum was open every Sunday between 10 and 4 p.m. and it's been closed for some time now. I can't exactly remember how long, but probably about 18 months or thereabouts. The executive are actually meeting next weekend to decide if we can talk about opening the museum again. If things change in the next week, there's going to be some announcements in BC on opening up things. So hopefully we can start to open up again soon. The museum is founded back in 1994 by a number of vintage radio enthusiasts. The names are on the slide there. And it became a registered charity in 1995 with the purpose to preserve, restore, and exhibit to the public a collection that reflects radios in Canada. That's a sort of an abbreviated version. It goes on a bit, I think, the actual full purpose. And the current location in the grounds of Riverview, I can't remember exactly when that came into being, but probably around about 2000. But before that, there was a couple of other locations proposed, one in New Westminster and one in North Vancouver. They fell through. The New Westminster one fell through because I believe the city wanted to own the collection of vintage radios in exchange for the use of the building. And I'm not really sure why the North Vancouver one didn't happen, but it didn't. At the moment, well, in 2020, there was 60 members. There used to be quite a few more when I first joined. I think it was well over 100. I think 160 rings a bell at one point. Currently, it's $25 a year to subscribe to the museum. You can visit it as many times as you want, obviously pre-COVID, or when the restrictions are lifted. And as I mentioned, it's self-funding. The museum applies for grants and has been quite successful over the years in getting various grants. And Bruce Winter has been instrumental in applying for those and making the case to get the grant and being successful in getting them, you know, from things like BC lotteries and local government grants. But otherwise, it's self-funded by membership, by entrance fees, by restoration of people's vintage radios. They bring radios in that they want restored and so on. And also movies, which I'll come on to in a later slide. It's run by volunteers, and from those volunteers, directors are elected by the members, and the elected directors form an executive to conduct the business. And of course, you've got the usual structure of president, vice president, treasurer, and secretary. And I was the president for a number of years, and then vice president. Bruce is the treasurer. I'm not currently, I don't currently have an office. But I'm a director. The volunteers conduct tours of the museum. They maintain the inventory. They repair and restore radios, either for the museum or for members of the public. It's a good source of income. And of course, they, like at any organization like this, they like to shoot the breeze. And it's a bit of a social club, really, which is great because you can share your interests and share stories and talk about your latest projects, etc. And the photograph on this slide is actually the antennas of the Coquitlam Amateur Radio Society, who are next door in the same building. But it's a great landmark. If you're looking for the museum in these extensive grounds, you can look for those antennas and you'll easily find the museum. This is a slide I actually put in just this morning, so Gary and Bruce hadn't seen this one, but I thought it was worth mentioning this. That there used to be, when I joined, an almost accept anything with a wire on it policy at the door. So if anybody showed up with an old radio or anything really, I've seen some weird things coming there, like X-ray equipment and large screen projectors and everything. And basically, they accepted everything, thinking it would be useful one day. And of course, there's finite space available, and so it's quite a large facility, but it's groaning at the seams now, and we've had a big clear out, several big clear outs over the years. So back in about 2014, we revised the acceptance policy based on a triage, and it's depicted on this slide as a bullseye. So the purpose of intent of the SPARC Museum is kind of at the center of the bullseye. So it really focuses on Canadian and then US and other manufacturers, vintage radios, vintage radio parts and paraphernalia, and then you've got the sort of the secondary ring of that triage, which are things like television, audio equipment, amateur radio, marine, aviation, military, broadcast equipment, things like that. And then eventually you get into the more peripheral stuff, which would maybe be laboratory test equipment or radar equipment, things like that. Just as a way of filtering filtering what came into the collection and also giving you a way of deciding what could be disposed of from the collection. So I'll now run through some of the areas of the collection. It's the display areas separated into a number of different areas. And these are, I think they're in approximately alphabetical order. So that's kind of how it is. So the first one I'll talk about is the amateur radio collection, which is pretty extensive, as you can see from the photograph on this slide. And it's got its own booth. It's sort of an amateur radio operating booth. And the intent was to have that as an operating station on Sundays when the public were in. If there was a radio ham volunteer there, they could use the station. It's been off the air for a number of years now for various reasons. And one of the main reasons is that there's just too much of the equipment that has been accumulated in that area. So you can't actually operate anymore. As you can see there, the ham license is VE7CHR, which stands for Canadian Heritage Radio. And as I mentioned earlier, it's right next door to the Coquitlam Ham Radio Club. So their antennas are quite something else. But at the moment, I think all we've got access to is perhaps a dipole. The main ham radio collection includes just examples of just about everything. A lot of Collins equipment in there, great shape as well, and a lot of boat anchor equipment, Hamel and Hallicrafters, a lot of Heath kits, Drake and Collins equipment. There's accumulated there and in the storage area in the back. And another view of what used to be the operating desk. The radio on the bottom right there is one I actually restored one of those. I've had that one at home as well, doing some comparison tests, but it's a great radio. Anyway, you can see extensive collection there. Move on to something a little bit different. The museum became home to a collection of of telegraph equipment, which came from the Bamfield station on Vancouver Island here, where I am. I'm based in Victoria on Vancouver Island, and Bamfield is in the sort of southwest of Vancouver Island. And it was the North American terminus for the Canada-Australia underwater cable, a 4,000 miles long cable. And the station was located near Tofino on the west coast of Vancouver Island there. And SPARC became the home to the equipment from this station, which was owned by Parks Canada. And I don't know the history behind why we became it. It was already there when I arrived at the museum. And it occupies a huge bank of the storage area in the rear of the museum. There's some beautiful artifacts in there. I've only seen some of them. They're all packed away and catalogued. But the transfer of the equipment happened last year, I think it was last year, from Parks Canada to SPARC, who now formally own the equipment. Unfortunately, we haven't got the space in the museum to display much of this. It's an extensive collection, a lot of duplicate items. There's a few photographs on this slide and the next which show them sort of relays and transmitters and galvanometers, all brass and wood, real nice late 19th century electronic type equipment. It doesn't necessarily, it's kind of in the peripheral area of that bullseye diagram. It doesn't really belong in the museum. It's kind of got an interest and there's nowhere else to house it. So but SPARC are really contemplating what to do with this collection at the moment. Okay, the main area in the museum is given over to broadcast radios, or domestic type radios. And it's set out in various historic areas, so from the 1900s through to the 1950s, 60s, roughly. And as I say, it's been getting more and more cluttered over the years as accumulated more and more radios and try to triage it out. But there's a really good representative selection of broadcast radios in the museum. Not as nicely laid out, unfortunately, as in the Hammond Museum, as you saw in the last presentation, but some of the display cabinets are really well done, and this slide shows one of those. So we're trying to mainly collect Canadian and US sets, which are prevalent in Canada, but also some UK and European models are there as well. And even Japanese radios are there, sort of Far East radios that came in the 60s and 70s. There's some of those too. And you can see in this photograph here sort of a cluttered area. There's a lot of radio-related artifacts and paraphernalia. There's a great collection of crystal radios as well. There's a good novelty radio display, sort of little rockets and things like that. And most radios have been donated by volunteers and members of the public over the years. And only a few sort of more special ones have been bought when an opportunity has arisen and the executive felt it worthwhile to invest in a radio for the collection. That's been done. An example of that would be a McMurdo Silver Masterpiece 5 we bought from a collection about 3 or 4 years ago. The marine collection is also fairly extensive. Sort of reflects the connection to the West Coast fishing and Navy base here in Victoria, with a lot of ship-to-ship and ship-to-shore type equipment. There's Marconi equipment from the Princess Patricia and Racal equipment, which you can see the Racal RS-17 there on the center of the photograph. From an RCN destroyer, there was a batch of these brought into the museum a number of years ago, and members bought them, and some of them were restored. I used to have one, I've sold it on now, but they're absolutely great radio. I love those Racals. And of course, there's local radio manufacturing. Spilsbury and Tyndall as an example. Chisholm's another example. And there's display areas for those in the museum. The museum's also got a broadcast studio. Photograph here on the slide shows that with the Jack Collins control board in the middle there. Sort of reflects the sort of 1950s era. There's transcription turntables. There's a couple of large tape recorders and so on, and other studio equipment. And it broadcasts locally on AM and FM. It's a very interesting place to have a poke around. There's another example of it here with the volunteer operating the console. You can see a couple of the tape decks on towards the upper left part of the photograph there. And yeah, it's great. And there's a whole, on the shelves there's a whole stack of tapes from radio stations. Some of these are originals. I spent a lot of time transcribing a lot of those tapes, which are starting to flake off and become all sticky, because that's what happens to old tapes. Transcribe those onto MP3s and CDs to preserve them. They're sort of local radio broadcasts from the 70s, 80s, 90s, which have got some interest. One corner of the display area is dedicated to military, as well as the sort of marine navy type equipment I showed earlier. There's a lot of sort of army type equipment and Air Force type equipment there as well. And this photograph here shows some of that. A couple of Army 19 sets on the right hand side of the photograph there, sort of as used in tanks in the Second World War. I actually cut my teeth on one of those when I was 15. My uncle gave me one because he didn't know what to do with it. And I managed to get it working, and that was the first radio I guess I worked on. And it was great. I really enjoyed working on that, and that was the start of me restoring radios, I guess, back when I was 15. There's a fantastic collection of equipment there, and also in the back storage area there's some equipment that could usefully be restored. Hopefully one day it will be, but it's displayed in a sort of foxhole environment. You can see better on these two photographs here. On the top left there, they've got the old webbing sitting over the top, gives a sort of military feel to it. And on the bottom right photograph there, you can see some of the Navy racks of the Racal Area 117 and peripheral equipment as synthesizers and things like that we use with those sets. And at the extreme left, bottom left there, there's a couple of Marconi CSR5s. I restored a couple of those recently for people. So yeah, certainly an interesting place to poke around in. The museum's also got an extensive library. In fact, I think it's got too much paper, but it's still of interest to people. There's a lot of extensive collection of magazines. I think I must have gone through about every copy of Radiocraft, Wireless Worlds, UK magazine, QST, Amateur Radio magazine, lots of books, reference books, and of course you've got all the Raiders and Batemans and Sam's catalogues, as well as various manufacturers' service manuals, which come in really handy. If you're servicing a radio, you can find the actual service manual. It's much better than finding a poor scan in Riders. There's also an extensive collection of shortwave commercial radio sets. Again, Marconi, Hamlin, Helicrafters, Eddystone, which is my particular mark that I've collected over the years, National, RCA, Collins, and there's one or two local manufacturers there as well. For example, that orangey red looking radio and that blurred photograph on this slide is a VRL receiver from the Second World War, manufactured by Vancouver Radio Laboratories, which later became the Chisholm Industries, manufacturing domestic radios and TVs. And that nice looking radio there is an Eddystone 750, which I restored for the museum. The museum's also got a really nice, fairly authentic sort of Titanic style radio room. It's actually a reconstruction of the Carpathia radio room. I believe it's from the set of the 1996 television movie Titanic, which donated after the movie. It houses sort of period type equipment set out as it would have been in the Carpathia back in 1912. It also houses some other equipment. It's got a Marconi triple tuner and a magnetic detector. And out of sight on this photograph, there's a big glass Leyden jar battery bank, which is very unusual. Also, there's a television collection, and Bruce has been working on this over the years, and I was fascinated to see some of these old TVs working. I'm not a TV guy, but it's great when you see something like a Philco predictor working, and with an old 1960s style TV program on it. It's just great. So there's a big collection of TVs. Again, I think at the moment it's difficult to get into the TV booth. It just isn't big enough for the number of sets that are in there, as you can see on these two photographs here. One recent, or fairly recent addition to the collection is a donation by Bob Murray, who wrote the book on early Canadian radios, and well, he edited it. A number of articles in there written by other people, some I think written by Bob himself. That really does explain things like the history of Marconi in Canada and so on. Very, very good book. If you haven't seen it, definitely worthwhile getting that. I think it's still available. Visited his apartment several times after he moved to Vancouver. He was based in Winnipeg, I think, and then he moved to Vancouver about maybe 20 years ago, maybe 15 years ago, when he retired. And I visited his apartment and with Bruce actually, and looked at his collection, and he was disposing of it to various museums around the country. And I think the AWA, for example, took some sets. And he has some very unique, very early radios, not just Canadian, but a lot of Canadian ones. And he actually donated a number of rare Northern Electrics and other sets to the SPARC Museum, along with the display cabinets, which is very generous of him. And that was probably about 3 or 4 years ago now. And I think the last time I was at the museum, which is quite some time ago because of COVID, these were being set up and in one corner of the museum. But very, very interesting collection. I mentioned earlier that one of the sources of funding for the museum are restorations. The public bring radios that have been passed down in the family, so they've got sentimental value. All the people have bought at flea markets and so on, and then realize they're out of the depth and trying to get it to work. So they bring them in, and there's a charge to repair or restore these things, depending on what needs doing. So it's been a big source of income over the years for SPARC. There's a large electronic workshop right at the front of the museum where volunteers work and repair the chassis. And in the back room where the storage area is, there's a sort of cabinet workshop and a nice spray booth in there to get good finishes on the cabinets. There's a large tube vault, and there's a boneyard of old equipment, old chassis and things, and parts removed from chassis that are used for the restoration work. The photograph there is the McMurdo Silver Masterpiece 5 that I restored for the museum about 18 months ago. The museum's won a couple of international radio restoration competitions as well. The two models are a Silvertone model 3766, which you can see in the photograph on this slide. And that one of the features of that restoration was that the dial escutcheon, which tends to warp on these radios, was 3D printed. So it was redrawn in CAD and then 3D printed, which you can see there. So it looks perfect. There's not many of those around and looking as good as that. So that won first prize in the international radio competition. And we also restored a Patterson Model 308 and entered that, and won second prize with the Patterson. So we're kind of pleased about that. And those two radios are in the entrance foyer of the museum in cabinets with some details about the restoration work on them. I worked on the chassis and others worked on the cabinets. And on the website includes many articles written by members, mostly by me, I think, on the various restorations, including these two competition winners. Top photograph there shows the front bench chassis sort of workshop area, and the bottom right photograph shows the tube vault. Tubes are sorted by alphabetical numerical order. By volunteers. They'll go in there and we'll sort through tubes that are donated in boxes by members of the public and so on. But thousands and thousands of tubes. They're not just stored here, they're actually stored elsewhere as well. A couple of views of the rear workshop. The top left photograph there shows the spray booth on the left-hand side. That's the glass doors of the spray booth. which has got filters and everything in it. So it's great to spray things in there. It takes the fumes out right away and doesn't affect the rest of the workshop. You can see a few cabinets on the bench there. They're in various stages of restoration. And the volunteer there on the photograph on the right is Jerry Taylor, who sadly passed away last year. But I knew Jerry for a number of years, and he was a great guy. And he used to really enjoy restoring vintage radios. Another source of income for the museum is movie prop rentals, and I don't know the exact sort of amount of funds that come in here, but it's in the thousands and thousands from this. There's a number of productions listed there on the left-hand side of this slide. The Man in the High Castle was a sort of a dystopian vision of a future where Nazis won World War II and took over America and so on. And the photographs on this slide depict that. The main photograph there is the Britannia mine on the road up to Whistler from Vancouver. And when I was working, I was a professional engineer, and I worked in restoring that mine, sort of environmentally restoring that mine. For about 20 years of my working career was spent with that project on my file. But in this movie, it was used as part of I guess it was used as a prop in a way, but used as a set for a number of the final episodes of that television series, which was pretty good. I enjoyed it. SPARC also gets involved with very special events over the years. They've had like a broadcast station. You can see on this photograph in the slide there is one of the volunteers, Peter Trill, working the broadcast station from a mobile booth. Various displays at other events in Coquitlam and elsewhere. And Riverview itself, I mentioned it's an arboretum. Well, every fall there's a tree fest has been held there. I don't know if for the last couple of years, maybe not because of COVID, but it was open to the members of the public, and there's tours of the various trees in the arboretum. And the museum used to put on a display there as well, so people visiting the arboretum could call in at the museum. And Bruce is on that lower right-hand slide there with another volunteer. Of course, there's a SPARC website. I'm sure most people on this call have probably called on that at some point. It's sparkradio.ca. The collections I've kind of briefly run through this morning are all covered on our website, plus a lot more information. Various restoration articles are available for download. There used to be an internet radio broadcast available. It hasn't been operational for a little while. I think Peter Trill used to do that. I'm not sure where things are at. Maybe Bruce can chip in on that one after the presentation here. And there's information on how to get to the museum. It's not the easiest place to find in the Riverview grounds. If you know where to look for the antennas, that's good. But otherwise, you can drive around there for 15-20 minutes without finding the museum. So definitely worth a visit if you haven't been to the website. And that's really it. And again, picture of Bruce here operating the drugstore tube tester, which is in the entrance part of the museum. Was a popular things for kids to poke around with. So if there's any questions or comments, suggestions, or if anybody would like to volunteer, that's even better. So we'll unmute and fire away, and I'll try my best to answer